December 8th, 2004. The backstage area of the Alrosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio, smelled like every small venue Dimebag Darrell had ever played. Stale beer, metallic tang of sound equipment, cigarette smoke despite the no-smoking signs. Outside, Ohio December cold hovered just above freezing, but backstage was overheated. The ancient heating system turning the cramped space into a sauna. Dimebag sat on a battered leather couch, his Dean ML guitar across his lap, fingers absently running through a warm-up scale while he talked to John Brooks, Damageplan's road manager who had been with the Abbott brothers since the Pantera days. It was 9:45 in the evening. In exactly 10 minutes, Dimebag would walk onto that stage for the last time, and the conversation he was having with John Brooks, the words he said in those final backstage moments, would haunt everyone who heard them for the rest of their lives. Because Dimebag Darrell knew something was wrong, he felt it. He said it out loud. But nobody understood what he meant until 6 bullets from a Beretta 9mm turned the Alrosa Villa stage into metal history's darkest crime scene. The thing nobody talks about is that Dimebag tried to warn people. Not explicitly, but in the way people do when they sense something off. Something their conscious mind can't articulate, but their instincts are screaming about. John Brooks would later tell investigators that Dimebag's demeanor that entire day had been strange. Not scared exactly, but distant, preoccupied, like he was listening to something nobody else could hear. And in those final 10 minutes before he walked onto the Alrosa Villa stage, Dimebag said something to John Brooks that would echo in John's mind every single day for the next 20 years. He said it casually, almost like a joke, but John remembered the way Dimebag's eyes looked when he said it. Dead serious. Somewhere beyond serious. Like he was confessing something he didn't want to be true. But before we go deeper into what Dimebag said in that backstage room, and why it matters more than anyone realized, if you're fascinated by the untold moments that reveal the truth behind music's greatest tragedies, hit that subscribe button now. This channel uncovers the conversations nobody else talks about, the warnings nobody heard, the final words that changed everything. The day started wrong. Damageplan had driven overnight from Cincinnati, and the tour was going better than expected, considering how brutal the previous 2 years had been. Pantera's breakup had been ugly, public, poisonous. Phil Anselmo's comments in that Metal Hammer interview, saying Dimebag deserved a severe beating, had split the metal community into camps. Through all of it, Dimebag tried to stay positive, tried to focus on Damageplan, tried to convince himself this new chapter was right. But the weight had been crushing him, and on the morning of December 8th, as the tour van pulled into Columbus, Dimebag had been quieter than usual. Bob Zilla, Damageplan's bassist, remembered Dimebag staring out the window at the gray Ohio landscape, not saying much, just watching bare trees and dirty snow along the highways. They stopped at a Denny's off Interstate 71, and Dimebag ordered his usual along with the first of several blacktooth grins that day, his signature Crown Royal and Coca-Cola mix. Patrick Lockman, Damageplan's vocalist, noticed Dimebag was drinking faster than usual, like he was trying to shake off something that wouldn't let go. They reached the Alrosa Villa around 2 in the afternoon. The venue was a dive, honestly, a former banquet hall converted into a concert space with a capacity of around 500 people. The stage was low, maybe 2 feet off the ground, barely elevated above the crowd. There was no barrier, no security buffer between performers and audience. Dimebag loved that intimacy, but security experts would later point out it was a nightmare scenario. You could walk right up to that stage. You could reach out and touch a performer, You could jump onto that stage and nobody would stop you until it was too late. Sound check went fine, and by the time they finished dialing everything in, the stage sounded powerful, aggressive, exactly how Dimebag wanted it. But as soon as sound check ended and house lights came back up, that distant look returned. Vinnie Paul noticed, asked if everything was okay. Dimebag said he was fine, just tired, missing home. Vinnie didn't push it. The brothers had an understanding that didn't require explaining everything. The opening bands played their sets, filling the Alrosa Villa with bodies and energy. Damageplan's set was scheduled for 9:45, and as that time approached, the band gathered backstage in the small green room, barely big enough for a couch, mini fridge, and folding chairs. Dimebag sat tuning his guitar, John Brooks double-checking the set list. Vinnie, stretching before his drum set, Patrick doing vocal warm-ups, Bob scrolling through his phone. It was 9:35 when Dimebag looked up from his guitar and said something that made John Brooks stop and pay attention. Dimebag glanced toward the door leading to the stage and said something felt off tonight. John asked what he meant, and Dimebag shook his head like he was trying to clear a thought that wouldn't form into words. He said the crowd felt different, heavier somehow, more chaotic than usual. John pointed out they couldn't even hear the crowd from backstage, but Dimebag insisted he could feel it. He talked about how after playing live for 20 years, you develop a sixth sense about audiences, about energy in a room. Some crowds are there to have a good time. Other crowds, the ones that worry you, they're there for something else. Catharsis, maybe, or violence, or just the opportunity to be part of something that gets out of control. Dimebag said he'd been feeling that second kind of energy all day, ever since they pulled into Columbus. John Brooks didn't know what to say. He'd been on the road with Pantera and Damageplan for years, seen Dimebag in every possible mood. But this was different. This was Dimebag trying to articulate something he couldn't quite name, and John could tell it was bothering him more than he wanted to admit. So John did what road managers do. He tried to lighten the mood, made a joke about Dimebag being psychic now, about adding fortune teller to his resume. Dimebag laughed, a short, sharp bark that didn't reach his eyes, and then he said something John would replay in his mind 1,000,000 times afterward. Dimebag said that if something bad happened tonight, John should make sure Vinnie knew it wasn't his fault, that none of it was anyone's fault, that sometimes things just happen, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. John Brooks froze, trying to read whether this was still a joke or whether Dimebag was serious. And what he saw in Dimebag's face was something he'd never seen before. Fear. Not panic, but the deep existential kind that comes from knowing something terrible is coming and being powerless to prevent it. John started to ask what Dimebag meant, but before he could, a stage crew member knocked and said they were 5 minutes to stage time. Dimebag stood, slinging his Dean ML over his shoulder, adjusting the strap. He looked at John one more time, and the fear was still there, pushed back behind his professional mask. Dimebag said they should get this done, that the crowd was waiting. And then he walked out of that green room, Vinnie falling into step beside him, the two brothers heading toward the stage entrance. What John Brooks didn't know was that Nathan Gale was already inside the Alrosa Villa. He had arrived early, before doors opened, and convinced Dr. Staff to let him in by claiming he was with an opening band. Security footage reviewed after the shooting would show Gale standing near the back during opening acts, not moving much, just watching the stage with an intensity several audience members later described as unsettling. Gale was 25, a former Marine discharged 3 years earlier after exhibiting mental instability. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Poorly managed with medication, Gale often refused. In Gale's fractured mind, Pantera's breakup had been personal betrayal. Gale believed, with absolute certainty, that Pantera had stolen songs from him, that Dimebag specifically had taken lyrics and music Gale had somehow transmitted and used them without permission. This delusion had been growing for years, and by December 2004, it had reached breaking point. Gale had been to multiple Damageplan shows on this tour, always standing near the back, always watching Dimebag with what security later described as a predatory expression. He had approached Dimebag after one show in Michigan, tried to talk about the stolen songs, about how Pantera owed him money and credit. Dimebag had been polite but firm, explaining he didn't know what Gale was talking about, that there was some misunderstanding. Gale left without causing a scene, but witnesses said his face went blank in a deeply disturbing way, like a switch had been flipped. Now, at the Alrosa Villa, Nathan Gale was carrying a Beretta 9mm loaded with .30-06 caliber rounds, waiting for Damageplan to take the stage. At 9:45 exactly, house lights dropped and the crowd surged forward. The venue was packed, maybe 400 people, and the energy was electric. Damageplan's intro music started playing, building tension before the band hit the stage. Vinnie Paul walked out first, acknowledging the crowd with a raised fist. Patrick Lockman and Bob Zilla followed. Then Dimebag walked out, Dean ML in hand, stage lights catching the lightning bolt inlays. The crowd roared, and Dimebag's face broke into his trademark grin, that huge, genuine smile that made you feel part of something important. Dimebag walked to center stage, adjusted his strap, and looked out at the sea of faces. He couldn't see Nathan Gale, who was moving through the crowd now, pushing forward with determination, hand inside his jacket gripping the Beretta. Dimebag raised his pick hand, counted off the tempo to Vinnie, and launched into the opening riff of Breathing New Life, that crushing groove-heavy riff that defined Damageplan's sound. The crowd started moving immediately, heads banging, fists in the air, bodies slamming in controlled chaos. Dimebag was fully in the moment now, all the weird energy pushed aside by the pure pleasure of playing. He got through approximately 2 minutes and 15 seconds of Breathing New Life. That's all. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. And then Nathan Gale jumped onto the stage from the side, pulling the Beretta as he moved, and before anyone processed what was happening, Gale raised the gun and fired, directly at Dimebag Darrell's head. The first shot hit Dimebag in the back of the skull at point-blank range, killing him instantly. Dimebag dropped to the stage, his Dean ML clattering beside him, feedback from amplifiers creating a sustained note audience members described as the most terrible sound they'd ever heard. Gale fired again and again, walking across the stage in methodical pattern, shooting anyone who moved. Nathan Bray, a fan granted backstage access, was shot in the chest and killed. Aaron Halk, Damageplan's head of security, rushed Gale and was shot 3 times, dying before he hit the ground. Jeff Thompson, a Damageplan employee who tried to help, was shot and killed. The entire shooting lasted approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds in which Nathan Gale fired 15 rounds total, killing 4 people and wounding 3 others before law enforcement arrived. Officer James Niggemeyer of Columbus Police was first on scene, entering through a back entrance, assessing the situation in seconds. When he saw Gale holding a hostage at gunpoint on stage, Niggemeyer fired a single shotgun blast that killed Gale instantly. By the time Niggemeyer reached the stage, Dimebag Darrell had been dead less than 2 minutes, but it was already too late for Vinnie Paul screaming his brother's name from behind his drum kit. Too late for the 400 people who came to see a metal show and witnessed murder. John Brooks was backstage when he heard the shots. He knew what they were immediately, that unmistakable crack of gunfire. John ran toward the stage entrance, and the first thing he saw was chaos, people screaming and running, stage lights still on but music stopped, feedback howling through the PA. He saw Vinnie being pulled away from his drum kit by security, Vinnie fighting them, trying to get to his brother. John saw Dimebag lying on the stage in a position his mind refused to accept as real. Blood pooling. The Dean ML beside him. And John Brooks understood what Dimebag had been trying to tell him backstage. The bad feeling. The sense that something was wrong. Dimebag had known. Maybe not consciously, but some part of him had sensed what was coming. And he had tried to make sure that when it happened, Vinnie would know it wasn't his fault. The investigation into Nathan Gale's motives lasted months. Gale's family revealed his mental illness history, his paranoid delusions about Pantera, his refusal to stay on medication. But no explanation would satisfy people who loved Dimebag, who watched one of metal's kindest souls murdered on stage doing what he loved most. Vinnie Paul would never perform again, spending the rest of his life until his death in 2018 processing the trauma of watching his brother die. The metal community would never feel safe in small venues again, the shooting leading to widespread security changes, metal detectors becoming standard where before there had been only trust. And John Brooks would carry Dimebag's last words forever, telling the story only to trusted people who would understand. Dimebag had known something was wrong. He had felt it, and his last request, spoken backstage 10 minutes before he died, had been to make sure Vinnie knew it wasn't his fault. The story of that backstage conversation didn't become public knowledge for years. John kept it private, sharing only with Vinnie and a small circle of Pantera and Damageplan family. But in later interviews and documentaries about Dimebag's life, John finally talked about that night, about what Dimebag said, about the look in his eyes suggesting he knew December 8th would be his last show. The metal community, hearing that story, found both comfort and horror. Comfort because it confirmed what they believed about Dimebag, that he thought about others first, cared more about his brother and friends than himself. Horror because it raised the terrible question of whether things could have been different. If Dimebag had been more explicit, if John had taken it more seriously, if security had been stricter, could tragedy have been prevented? The answer, painful as it is probably not. Nathan Gale was determined, had been planning for weeks, possibly months. If not the Alrosa Villa on December 8th, it would have been another venue, another night. The failure wasn't in anyone's inability to read Dimebag's premonition. The failure was systemic, a mental health system that let Gale slip through cracks, concert security infrastructure that never imagined someone would bring a gun to a metal show intending to kill the performer. Dimebag was a victim of forces beyond anyone's control, and the guilt Vinnie Paul carried, that John Brooks and Damageplan crew carried, was misplaced, but inevitable. Because when someone you love dies violently and senselessly, the human mind searches desperately for what could have been done differently. But Dimebag's last words to John Brooks weren't about prevention. They were about forgiveness. They were about making sure that when grief set in, the people he loved wouldn't destroy themselves with guilt. That message, delivered in a cramped backstage room, was Dimebag Darrell's final gift to his brother and friends. And in the years since, As the metal community has processed the loss of one of its most beloved figures, those words have taken on significance beyond that one night. They've become a reminder that sometimes the most important thing we can do for people we love is tell them explicitly, without reservation, that whatever happens, it's not their fault. That life is chaos and tragedy is random, and the only thing we control is how we treat each other in the time we have. Dimebag spent his career making people feel included, making fans feel part of something bigger, making his brother feel invincible. And in his last 10 minutes alive, he used that same generosity to try to protect Vinny from the pain coming, to give him permission to survive and keep going even after the world ended. That's the story of love expressed the only way Dimebag knew how, through actions and words and a lifetime of putting other people first. And that's how legends are made. Not through music or fame or talent, but through the way they make people feel even after they're gone.